All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joel Drevlo. I am a certified trainer with MAXQDA. We are delighted to have you with us today to take a look at organizing teamwork with new analysts in MAXQDA. So this topic is actually really one of my favorite things to talk about with regards to MAXQDA, as I find team-based analysis to be just a really exceptional way to look at qualitative data. We'll talk about some of the specific reasons for this throughout the sessions, some of the sort of nice assets or pieces that you get from being able to do this collaboratively or in team-based approaches. So we'll talk about some of those specifics as we move through. Additionally, I find that specifically in the context of working with new analysts, whether you're training students or if you're training maybe people in an organization that are new to qualitative analysis, doing this training in the context of actual data analysis when you're working with real life data, when you're having these discussions, is a really engaging way to do this. And from a personal perspective, it's one that I found to have very good results and then has been very successful for me. So again, we'll expand on this a little bit later into the session as we get into some of the specific pieces sort of MAXQDA or some of the things that you can be mindful of as you start to undertake these types of analysis. So this is also going to be based off of a chapter I co-wrote with some colleagues about our own experience doing team-based analysis. So I've actually got the link here. I'm going to go ahead and, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to go ahead and drop this into the chat here. If I can get it highlighted. Okay. Okay, so you should have a link to that. This is a free publication that MAXQDA put out recently. That is a collection of sort of best practices from a number of different analysts and sort of the work that they did with MAXQDA. So you can check out our specific chapter in here, which is about team-based analysis. So during the session, some of it's going to take you through specific features and functions. Some of it we're going to look at concepts related to MAXQDA. So we'll be looking at concepts around project management, how to sort of build a productive analysis team. I want to give some tips that you can implement immediately. So some things that you can do that will basically provide some nice concepts that you can do immediately, but then also some concepts that you can adapt to your own perspective and things that you do. So the last little piece of housekeeping, we're going to be moving through things at a pretty decent clip to cover as much as we can throughout the session, but we are recording this and this will be distributed later on, so you'll be able to check out these things at a more accommodating speed. And I'm also going to leave some time at the close of the webinar for any questions, so if you do have those, go ahead and pop them into the question and answer box and we'll grab them at the end of the session. All right, so on with the session here. First thing, just to tell you a little bit about me, I am a Verbi cooperation partner based out of the Boston area in the United States. I'm also, as I said earlier, a certified MAXQDA trainer. My research background is primarily in program evaluation. I worked previously with a university-based outreach organization, so we were delivering educational program in different communities, and so we looked at how can we do our programming better, and what kind of things can we do to expand our audience and things like that. Like I said, having written a chapter in a recent publication, I have some experience with teamwork in MAXQDA and sort of a special interest there, and then of course I provide QDAS, qualitative data analysis, software training, specifically with MAXQDA. So if you would like to get in touch with me, you can reach out. I've got my email listed here, joel.drevlo@iqdas.com. This is a professional address, so feel free to ask any questions about this session, things related to MAXQDA, or maybe if you have some ideas about things that you might like to collaborate on. Okay, so our session agenda or our goals for today, the first thing that we're going to take a look at is when you're doing team-based projects, how can you sort of establish clear roles within your project, and sort of what are those roles and how are they important to facilitating nice, clean teamwork throughout your project. We're also going to look at some specific tools within MAXQDA that you can use when you are assigning work. So these are some things that make it easier for analysts to remember what specific analysis they were supposed to do, whether that be coding, paraphrasing, writing memos, all kinds of different things. Basically just some built-in features that you can use to make sort of the teamwork flow a little bit easier for you. We'll talk specifically about some of the routines that you might be able to adopt in team-based analysis, and sort of not just the routine itself, but why is the routine important, talking about how this can build up the confidence of new analysts, and sort of how it simplifies the workflow in a project. When you're working with multiple analysts in a project in MAXQDA, it's really important to have a agreed upon sort of set workflow in order to make sure that people are working in the certain parts of the documents that they're supposed to be working in. That's kind of it's a very important piece. Finally, at the end, I'm going to give you just a demonstration of some of the specific tools that that we use to do team-based analysis, and give you an idea of what the project flow looks like in terms of creating project files and distributing those. So to tell you just a little bit about sort of the project that this was built off of, and if you take a look at the chapter in the link that I've shared in the chat, you'll be able to see this more. So the project, we were working UW-Madison Division of Extension, and this was right during the beginning stages of the pandemic back in, would have been early 2020. And basically what we were looking at was how was our organization responding to COVID. Given that most of our education happens in person, we had to really shift our delivery model. So we wanted to see what were educators doing, and then to be able to bring that back to our stakeholders, and also to be able to disseminate that information to other educators delivering similar programming. So we were working with a specific type of data. In our case, educators are required to report on their work. And during the pandemic, this was shifted to a weekly rhythm. So we were fortunate that we had a pretty large amount of data, and that it was kind of constantly refreshing. So we were able to get a pretty good real-time picture of what was happening. That data had specific components of it, so a lot of our analysis was structured around those specific components. So we were able to look at what types of things people were doing through the activity, who they were working with through the audience. We were able to look at specific learning outcomes or specific things that were being taught, and a lot of these were topics specific to the pandemic, like hand washing, transmission, sort of vaccines, treatments, all kinds of different stuff. Additionally, we were also able to look at sort of this outcome piece, which was looking at sort of educational outcomes or changes that we wanted to see in the community. And then finally, the products that we then generated from this analysis, we were able to generate them on sort of a more focused lens on specific institutes within our organization, and then also wider angle lenses across the entire organization. So it was a pretty interesting project in that we were able to look at a number of different things and present those on sort of differing sizes. All right, so let's jump in then to this first topic in our chat today about project roles. So and this may look slightly different depending on you know, the members of your team that you have available, but in our specific project, we had sort of 3 different roles. We had the project manager role, the team lead, and then we had analysts. And you'll be able to get a better sense of this when we look at sort of the project flow and how project files develop, get worked on, get re-uploaded and changed, and sort of see who manages those things. But in general, the role for the project manager, the most important piece that they were responsible for was importing data. So creating the original project file, grabbing that initial data, and then since our project was refreshing on a weekly basis in terms of new data being available to us, to add that new data every week. So our project file was actually getting larger and larger. So the project manager also had to take on a role of deciding when to archive certain amounts of our data so that project files size remained manageable for people working in the team. Additionally, the project manager was responsible for merging the files. So when you have several different teams, or if you have several different analysts working, they may be working in different parts of the project file, and then you need someone to stitch those back together. So having one person in control of that maintains sort of the integrity of the project file from beginning to end. So you have sort of the same process happening, and you have the same individual making decisions. In cases where you might have conflicts because maybe some person in one of the teams, their work is conflicting with another team, so you might need to make decisions about which piece of information stays, or you may have to do some manual work migrating pieces of data over from both project files. And I'll show you some of those specific places where you might have conflicts as I get into demonstrating the actual merging piece. And then finally, the project manager is really the final voice on any kind of a decision that you have in the project. So if you have questions about coding, if there's questions about the methodological approach that you're doing, the project manager really needs to take on that role and sort of be the final say, the individual that makes the decision there about how you're going to proceed in those cases. In our case, we had one team lead. That was actually me. That was my role. The team lead really is responsible for sort of managing the schedule and the workload of the project. So they would notify the analysts when project files were available. They would be responsible for deciding which parts of the project the analysts were responsible to actually analyze, or that what their work was for, and then looking at those deadlines, making sure that the project was staying on track, basically. Additionally, the team lead should be able to answer questions, should be able to answer most questions. In certain situations, they're going to have to defer to the project manager, but they should be able to handle the majority of the questions that come up from the analysis teams. And then finally, you have your analysts, and in our case, that was student analysts that were from the university. So we had some undergraduates and some graduate students working with us, and the analysts are doing most of the work. So they're doing the coding, they're taking notes throughout code memos, maybe some in-document memos. And in our case, we actually included our analysts in the final write-up, as they were the ones working with the majority of the data. So they did actually have some sort of say in that aspect of it when we were creating reports. Having the analysts involved from beginning to end was a really nice aspect of this, and that's actually something we're going to talk about next. So it's important when you are working with these projects that you start slow. It can be kind of tempting to just disseminate a file and have people jump in. But it works a lot better for your project, especially if this is going to be sort of an iterative analysis where you're either adding new data to the project file or you're adding new codes to your code system, whatever it may be. It's really helpful to start slow. And in our case, we started with a group analysis. So we actually worked together as a team. So the project manager, the team lead, and the analysts were all together on a virtual meeting, and it is really possible to do this virtually. We were using Microsoft Teams, but you could use other software as well. Including the analysts in this beginning process, having them help you actually build the coding system is a really integral part of this, as it really helps them when they go off to then do coding. They have a very clear understanding of what these codes mean, when to apply them, when not to apply them, and they have sort of clarity about what pieces come first, what's the priority in your project. So it's important to have that built from the beginning so that everyone is kind of on the same page. If you're looking at things like you actually want to quantify things like intercoder reliability, this is going to be something that's definitely going to increase those statistics. Additionally, you want to document your work. So in our initial coding meetings, we made sure to record all of these when we were doing these in Teams and then have those files accessible to all the analysts. That way they were able to refer to specific meeting notes. We also documented things in a very particular way so that we had notes about specifically in code memos about when and when not to apply codes. We included really strong anchor examples so that folks knew when and when not to apply certain codes. So additionally, as you get into actually doing this routine, it's really helpful to make use of some of the built-in product features in MAXQDA, and I'll demonstrate these shortly, but there's a few that are particularly important. The document set function is going to be really important in order to be able to assign work. One of the most crucial things about doing teamwork in MAXQDA is making sure that you know where everyone is working. That way, individuals' work does not overlap. You don't want individuals necessarily working within the same document because you're likely going to get conflicts and that's going to cause problems when you go to merge files. So document sets are very important. The memos for document sets then become very important because you can include coding instructions, due dates for when things need to be done, what teams are for the analysis and other things like that. Document colors can also be quite useful. We actually implemented a specific system where we would have folks change colors to designate when they had finished working in a particular document. This was helpful also as we went to do merging sort of exchange files, being able to, if we assign specific colors to specific teams, we were able to activate just their work. So it's another way to segment your file to make sure that people are working in the place that they're supposed to be working. Memos, of course, are going to be very useful for tracking this stuff. And then also just the code system organization. So how you actually organize your code system can be very helpful. Keep in mind that, for more experienced analysts, some of this stuff may seem that this is very basic, but this is really geared towards newer analysts. So you want to try and make the interface in MAXQDA work as presented as straightforward as possible for your teams that are working. It makes it a lot more simple. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at an actual project file here then to demonstrate a few of these things. So you can see here, let me go ahead and open up a document here. We'll get back to this document later. This is sort of, I've diagrammed the actual workflow and how this works, but we'll talk about this towards the end of our session today. So one of the first things that you can do when you are creating a team-based project like this is to essentially try to keep everything within the project file itself. Having everything organized here within the project file means that you don't need to go looking through an email chain or a chat chain in Slack or Teams to find instructions or directions. You have everything contained within the file itself. So one easy way to do that is to actually create documents in MAXQDA. So in addition to be able to just import and work with data, you can actually create documents in MAXQDA. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our top level and we're going to create a document. We'll change the name then of this to something like project notes or whatever sort of makes sense in your particular context. And then in this file, by making sure that we have this activated, the editing mode, we can then include specific notes about this. So we can include things like goals. So what are the goals of our particular project? We can include things like our research questions. We can include things like our analysis questions, especially if your project is working sort of iteratively where you're building upon your analysis. This is going to be something that's really important. You'll also be able to include any relevant dates here, so when things need to be completed. You can include team members here. So being able to track who are the analysts, who's the project manager, who is the team lead, this can be helpful as well. So by keeping everything in here, especially at the top level of your document system, it really draws attention to it. Alternatively, if you wanted to keep this in your project memo, you could also do that here. Note that every MAXQDA project file only has one project memo, so this could serve sort of a similar capability. I do feel like having a system document here is a little bit more, it sticks out a little bit more than this particular memo. Some people might miss that, but that really is a personal preference in terms of how you want to manage things. But this can be really helpful to track certain aspects of your project. And again, keeping it within the project file is really important. Additionally, you can actually color code certain things. So the text editor has the opportunity to change colors. So if you wanted to have your analysis questions in a different color, that can be something that can be helpful as well. Color, I think, is sometimes maybe an underutilized aspect of organization in MAXQDA. So that's one piece in terms of organization and project management, keeping everyone on the same page. Another really important piece is the creation of document sets. So to do that, let me just go ahead and activate a handful of these survey documents. Okay, I'll just activate 5 of them here, and then we'll go ahead and create a new set from these. So when you create a new set, obviously you have the ability to change the name. So you would essentially name this, Team 1. Or if you had just individuals, you might put in a specific name, Andrew and Tina, for example. So it's very clear-cut, very straightforward that Andrew and Tina are responsible for these particular documents here. You can also include then in the memo sort of when this needs to be completed. And you might have some specific notes, analysis questions, or research questions, whatever works for your particular project. So being able to keep those things in the memo here, you're able to essentially disseminate these instructions to your analysis teams, and it's all contained within the project file. So this can be a really important aspect of this. Within these documents, you also have the opportunity to change these into specific colors. So for example, when Andrew and Tina are going through this, if they finish this, they might change the color of their document to green to signify that the analysis is complete. When you go then to make a exchange file, so when you're ready to actually create, export some teamwork, you can then come in and you could activate things by color. So I could decide to pick just my green documents that I know that those are complete. Now, in theory, that works. Sometimes if folks don't adhere to those situations where they're changing the colors for their documents, that can be kind of tricky. So you want to make sure that people are following those instructions. So do always, if you're the project manager or you're the team lead, it's your responsibility to make sure that individuals doing the analysis in your team are actually following those protocols that you've set in your analysis. Okay, we've talked a little bit about memos here in the document system, whether or not you're using a project memo or when you're using memos on sets in order to give instructions for analysts. Probably the most important memo in regards to doing team-based analysis is really these memos down here in your code system. And if we open up some of these, for example, I think work-life balance has some really good ones. Here we go. So you can see here in our well-being assessment, we have some notes in our code memo, specifically a code definition, basically saying what the purpose of this code is, how it's used for. An additional thing to include in these would also be examples. So some anchor examples, some really strong, clear examples of when this code should be used and when it shouldn't. Those So when it should be used and when it should not be used. And sometimes those sort of counterexamples of when it should not be used are actually just as relevant as the positive ones. It can be really helpful to help train analysts when to apply this code and when they should not be apply this code. In addition to keeping track of sort of the definition, the application, the examples of your memos, it's really helpful to create a top-level code of something like unsure. So you can put this in a number of places. You can have this at the top level, depending on how your code system is structured. If you're having analysts go through, you might have a specific unsure code that works within work-life balance. So if they're coding for work-life balance and they're unsure where it would go, they would put it here. These are really helpful for building discussion then in subsequent sessions. So when you have analysts come back and you work together as a team to sort of debrief how things are going, you're able to go through these examples and discuss them as a team. And this really helps build a clear kind of cohesive understanding of the interpretation of your code system. So these can be really helpful, and to encourage your analysts, especially early on in your project, that it really is okay to code things as unsure, because that promotes discussion, and you can't expect everyone to know exactly what they're doing at the beginning of the project. So this is a code that you definitely want to have. There's a couple of ways you can manage this. Sometimes you can just drop these in the top level code if you want. I like to include an unsure code. I think it's a little bit more straightforward about the purpose of that. So that's it. That's a really useful tool to be able to prompt and promote that discussion among the team. In addition to organizing your code system, just situating things logically, sort of in the actual steps that analysts apply the code. So for example, when in our particular data, we were looking, since we had data that was very explicit in terms of what audience we worked with and where we worked with them, those were the first steps. Those are fairly easy to identify. So if you have some type of structural code in your code system where you're looking at something that's fairly easy to identify, that's a good place to start. The more sort of subjective or like sort of thematic codes or categories towards the end that are maybe a little bit more difficult to discern, those should be, you know, secondary in terms of how your teams are applying them. That can just make the workflow a little bit easier. So organizing your code system in that, and you can even, you know, including things like that in your name. So for example, if I were to create this, I could just do something like step 1, and then I would have my code name here. I could then do step 2 and have my code name here. So again, for new analysts, you have to keep that sort of in the back of your head that we're working specifically with new analysts that are maybe unfamiliar with MAXQDA and how this type of analysis works. So, and of course, we'd want to have that in the right order. So step 1, step 2, and our code names. And so this basically, again, just gives some sort of clear instruction in terms of how analysts can put this work together in terms of what steps do they start with and how do they structure their analysis. Once you've analyzed your, once you've structured then your code system like that, you'll have your analysts go through these. Typically, it's best to work in pairs if possible, or in whatever groups you have available to you. That promotes some discussion, and it sort of allows to build up the interpretation of those specific code schemes. So now that you've actually done some analysis and you've broken these into teams, you've got multiple project files. How do you manage those project files? That's really the difficult piece of this. One way to do that is through the actual MAXQDA Team Cloud. You can actually get a Team Cloud account, and this will sort of manage some of that for you in the background. The nice thing is that this comes with cloud storage so that you're able to keep your project files there and then disseminate them. So that makes it a little bit simpler, but you can use You can use other software as well to house those files. Keep in mind, MAXQDA being a database program, you always need to be working from a local file. So if you use a suite like Dropbox or Google Drive or something like that, or Microsoft Teams, you need to download the file onto your computer or whatever it is you're working on, and actually work locally. Otherwise, you'll run into issues that could cause you some major problems in terms of corrupting your entire file. So always make sure you work locally. But if we look at this teamwork flow that I put together here, just sort of a basic outline of how this works. So the first step in this, and if you look into the Team Cloud a little bit and some of the resources that are available to you from MAXQDA, you'll see that the Team Cloud really mimics this flow. So the project manager is going to create the initial file. So they'll grab whatever data it is that you're going to be analyzing, and they'll create that initial file. They may have a code system added immediately. You may work together as a group to build that code system from the data. That's really going to depend on the approach that your project manager wants to take for this particular analysis. Once the file is created, the analysts are notified that the file is ready, and we used Microsoft Teams, so there's some nice notifications through Teams channels and things like that, where you can basically post notifications that a file is ready to go. Analysts then download the file onto their local machine. So if you're working in Teams, this is probably going to be done virtually. So you'll have a pair of folks working over Zoom or Microsoft Teams in our case. And one person will have the file open and they'll screen share, and then they'll do the coding together. Ideally, if you can, those individuals should swap every once in a while so that we can sort of share the load of who has to take notes and do those kinds of things during the analysis, but that's not absolutely necessary. I think that it is an important thing to do. It really is a pretty large responsibility to be taking all of the notes during analysis, to be taking code comments or expanding on memos, deciding which codes are applied. So it can be helpful to split up those duties. It also makes sure that you're disseminating the voice throughout your analysis. So the analysts have downloaded their data. Now they do their work, which I was just talking about. So depending on the size of your team, this can happen individually, in pairs, in groups. I think pairs are really nice. Groups of 3, I think, are probably ideal. Any bigger than that, it starts to get a little bit cumbersome. So once analysts have finished their work, and you've divided things like this to make sure that they're working in certain parts of the project, so they're not conflicting in documents, or if they are working in the same documents, they're applying different codes. So you want to make sure that the work is segmented properly. Once they've done that, the analysts then will date, initial, and upload their project file. So it's important for that step to happen. So if you're working in Teams or something like that, the analyst will save their project file, and they come up here to the save project as, and essentially they will add in the date that they've completed the analysis, and then their initials, so that we know whose project file it is and when it was completed. So once this is back up in the sort of shared repository, then the project manager goes to work, and then they will merge the work that has been done. So there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can merge 2 project files together. You can create an exchange file, which I think in this case is probably the simplest, especially if you've made a good use of document sets. You can create an exchange file where you grab just the documents that individual has worked on, and then you sort of add those, add in that work to your existing project file. Once that's done, then depending on how your project is structured, either your project is complete because the analysis is done, or in our case, the way that would work, the project manager would add another week's worth of data. And so we were constantly just doing this. We would add in a week of data, we would do the analysis, upload, merge the file, add in a week of data, and this cycle just repeated basically until we had gotten to a point where things were fairly stable in the pandemic, and we had a pretty good sense of what was going on. So this is going to be specific to your particular project and sort of how the analysis is working if you have sort of refreshing data in your project. But you get a pretty good sense of how this teamwork flow works. If you play around with MAXQDA's Team Cloud, it's very similar to this in that the project manager is responsible for initiating these workflows and disseminating the files. Once they have access to them, then they're responsible for making the decision of which data wins out if there's any conflicts in any kind of merge or anything like that. So this is sort of just a basic overview of sort of some of the concepts involved in teamwork and sort of how you can make this function a little bit, especially for new analysts that are, not only doing analysis, but are learning how to use MAXQDA. So you need to keep that in mind, that it's not just assigning qualitative codes to data for these newer analysts. It's also sort of the figuring out that initial learning curve of actually using qualitative data analysis software. So make sure that you consider that when you're working with new analysts. So I'll go ahead and stop here. I think that's about all the information that I have prepared for today, and then I'll stick around for a few minutes here for any questions that may come in. You can go ahead and drop those into the question box, and I will answer any questions that you might have.